I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico. And we're both just guys.
We're both just guys, just two guys hanging out with the podcast, but we're about to be joined by a third person. Guy is such a weird word, eh? It's like gendered, but also not gendered sometimes. Anyway, the third person who's coming on, a guy or not a guy, who could say, is Marika Rose, a podcast fave. You know her, you love her. She, I think, still has the record of a guest who has maybe the highest listen rate out of all of our episodes on the whole. So a fan favorite. She's also the person responsible for the great quote that you just heard at the end of our intro about being faithful to Christianity, betraying Christianity. Just a really brilliant person, and we're glad to have her back on the show to talk about angels, a thing that Matt and I have been trying our best to stumble through maybe, but to little effect. So we've got a real theologian on here to help us out.
Yeah, it's a really great conversation. Well, I don't know if it's a good conversation, but it's extremely good content from Marika. I think it is amazing, all of this stuff that she's bringing to the table. And how angels are really philosophical types of characters that make you think about the world in different ways. Anyways, a very enlightening interview from my end. I learned a lot of things about it. And I bet you will too. So buckle up and get ready to get angelic.
Before we get there, the book that Marika is promoting is called Theology at the End of the World. She talks about angels in that book and lots of other things too. Don't worry, you'll hear about it again. We're definitely going to have Marika back to chat about it more fully later on. But if you're in the UK, you can pre-order it from SCM Press. And if you're not in the UK, like Matt and I, you can buy it on the 31st of July, right around the corner. And it's going to be good. Matt and I got a sneak peek at a chapter to do this episode. And man, I got to tell you, Marika, she's brilliant, as you're about to find out, if you don't know already. But also, she's just a really good writer. It's very fun. There's a really nice balance between, here's a bunch of weird stuff about theology that you've never heard of, and also here's just what it's like to be a weird Christian. Here's the weird ideas that you have about yourself and the world around you, articulated in a way that even your youth pastor could understand. So
that's
you
true.
should get it.
The book is also just very entertaining to read. When you think of theology, you don't think of a good time, not usually, but this book is for sure. So get excited for it.
Yeah, get it. Theology at the End of the World, SCM Press. And without further ado, let's turn it over to Marika.
Marika, welcome back to the show. Longtime listeners will definitely remember you from a couple of episodes a few years back. I think still probably some of our most popular episodes, which is pretty interesting. But for people who don't know, who are you? Why should people be excited about your forthcoming book, Theology for the End of the World?
Yeah, so I'm Marika Rose. I am normally a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester in philosophical theology. I am currently not working for the University of Winchester because I'm also a member of the Universities and Colleges Union, which is the national UK higher education union. We are currently in the middle of a national marking and assessment boycott over pay workload, gender and racial pay gaps, and precarity. And my university specifically has decided to take the most punitive response to that. So as long as I'm not doing my marking, they're deducting 100% of my pay. If you, I thought I should kind of mention that. And if people want to support that action in any way, the UCU website, which is ucu.org.uk, you can donate to our fighting fund, and you can also, there's a little tool that lets you email VCs of universities to encourage them either to dock less of our pay or to pressure the kind of national university body to meet our demands in a kind of significant way. So that's what I'm normally doing and what I'm currently doing. I think when I was last here, I was talking about my first book, which was A Theology of Failure, Zizek against Christian Innocence. That was a more kind of academic thing. In July, I have a new book coming out called Theology for the End of the World. Basically, the premise of the book is what if we kind of, instead of trying to desperately sort of cling on to the things that we are afraid of losing in the middle of a society that feels like it's in kind of decline, we both committed to trying to understand how we got here, how the world was made, what role Christianity played in that, and then also thought about what it would mean to not try to desperately cling on to this world built as it is on violence and exploitation, but instead sided with the Christians across history who have instead tried to end the world.
Love it. Extremely cool, great energy, and what a great theme to be thinking about while you're also very mad at your employer. I think that's great. Yeah, well, we're excited to have you back on the show, and when the book is finally out, we're going to have you again. I think we'll do a full, proper look at the whole thing, but we have an incredibly specific task for you, Marika, this week. On the show, as we like to say, we are not theologians, and we do our best, but whether it's good or not, who could say? So we've been talking about angels, and we thought we really should probably have somebody who knows a thing or two about angels on the show to set us straight, or not, set us off in a better direction. Maybe that's a better way to put it. And we did this episode on Michel Serres. We were talking about angels philosophically and the weird things that they mean and do and say. And you've done a lot of work about angels, including in this book, but also before that. So we're welcoming you here, Marika, as our correspondent to the celestial heavens, a person who knows a lot about angelic hierarchy and so on. Tell us maybe a little bit about angels, the role they play, and why are you into them? What got you into angels?
Yeah, so I guess what got me into angels was being interested in Dionysius the Areopagite, who is, I think, more kind of commonly talked about as one of the kind of founders of mystical theology. 20th century philosophers get really into using Dionysius to think about the limits of language. But as he is kind of bringing together Christianity and Neoplatonism in this way that lets people think about language and being and desire, he is also in the process becoming one of the kind of first systematic angelologists. So you have a bunch of different things about angels in the Bible and the kind of early Christian literature. There's lots of scattered bits, but it's not particularly systematic. And so early Christians start to kind of try and figure out how to make a system out of those bits and pieces. And so Dionysius brings various biblical texts together and comes up with a 9 category ranking system for the angels that kind of sets the tone for a lot of later Christian angelology. And just after I finished my PhD writing about Dionysius, I did a postdoc where I was encouraged to think about theology and digital technologies. And I basically read Donna Haraway's Manifesto for Cyborgs, which is one of the kind of key texts in sort of feminist science studies. And she articulates the cyborg as a kind of figure of a kind of hybrid human being, so part organic, part technology. Cyborgs as these kind of limit figures, as these kind of perfected workers, yet also these workers who go wrong in various ways with glitches. And I was just really struck by the similarities between the way that Haraway was talking about the cyborg and the way that Dionysius talked about angels. So that was the kind of starting point, but it's ballooned into this more general interest in angels. I was thinking as you were talking, I teach a course at the moment about angels in medieval thought. The syllabus is available on An und für sich, the blog I sometimes write for. So if anyone wants to go and really dig into medieval angelology, there's lots of suggestions there.
That's great. I mean, we can talk more about the cyborgs maybe in a minute, but let's start with the medieval and work our way forward really quick here. So the quintessential medieval question about angels is how many can fit on the head of a pin? And I'm so excited for you to tell me, a real theologian, finally getting to the bottom of this question.
So this is an interesting question, and I think I'm correct in saying it's a question that people didn't actually specifically ask in the medieval period, but it does point to one of the ways that angels are really important in medieval thought. One of the things I would suggest is that angels function as kind of speculative figures, right? We even if we have Christians who will claim to have seen and encountered angels, they are not present to us in ways that let us kind of really study them. So what angels often let theologians do is to ask a bunch of questions, kind of like thought experiments. If we stripped away a lot of the complicating factors that makes asking questions about human being difficult and messy, and we just really kind of boiled it down to the purest form, how then would we think about questions like what free will is, how we know things, and particularly when it comes to the questions of angels and the head of a pin, questions about the nature of place. And so angels, one of the things I would suggest, and I think I mean this at least 50%, is that angels, angelology is partly the reason why modern science emerges. So one of the things that happens sort of in the mid to late medieval period is as Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, starts to kind of fragment, a lot of knowledge that has been kept within the Arabic-speaking world, but lost to the Latin-speaking world, starts to make its way into the Latin-speaking West. Some of that is some texts of Aristotle, which people haven't read. As universities start to get going in medieval Europe, these newly discovered texts by Aristotle become this kind of focus for theological, philosophical, and scientific speculation. So Aquinas is one of the first people to really kind of try and bring these new texts by Aristotle together with existing theological knowledge. And then in part because Jewish and Muslim thinkers are so important to the translation and the interpretation of Aristotle, there's a backlash within the Christian West. There's a council which produces a set of statements that are ruled heretical, including a lot about angelology. And then theologians have to go back to the drawing board and go, how do we think about angels without using these Aristotelian categories? And maybe that's why we start to get modern science. We lose this kind of Aristotelian framework. If we're talking about angels on the head of the pin, the really key thing is Aristotle's definition of a place. So for Aristotle, a thing's place is the innermost boundary of a thing which contains it. So basically, if we could kind of trace round the outline of your body, that would be your place. And what's important about that is your place is not just the dimensions, like how wide you are, how tall you are, how deep you are. It's also where you are located in relation to everything else. So we can't think a thing's dimensions without also thinking it in relation to the things around it. So that both means that everything is always located in relation to other things. It also means that things have a proper place. So it's not just that you exist always in relation, but that actually you should exist in particular kinds of relations. So stone's proper place is on the ground. If you throw it in the air, it will eventually return to its proper place on the ground. So one of the things that means is that an object always takes up volume. You can't just imagine an object kind of existing in blank space. One of the questions then you get for angelology is, if angels are beings who have bodies, how can they be in a particular place? One way of doing that would be to say, well, if an angel doesn't have a body, it's just everywhere. But then the problem is, how do we distinguish angels from God? So angels have to be limited in some way, but they're not limited by embodiment in the same way that human beings are. And so Aquinas' solution is basically to say that, so again, this is Aristotelian causation. A cause has to be present to its effect. So for an angel to interact with the world, it has to be present to the things that it's interacting with. So an angel is present for Aquinas basically wherever it is acting. So if an angel decides that it's going to come and whisper encouraging words into your ear or appear to you in a vision to inspire you, it is present to you as it is having an effect on you. So that gives Aquinas a way of thinking about location and causation and presence kind of without embodiment. As we move sort of to the later medieval period, post Aquinas, post the condemnations, we start to get slightly different accounts of angelic location, because they are sort of starting to let go of these Aristotelian categories. And so we get people like, I always get Scotus and Occam mixed up. So for Scotus, he starts to imagine that you can have dimension without location. So in Scotus, we start to find something like, I think, the more kind of more classical modern way of thinking about things, right? You imagine an object, and I think for a lot of, I certainly find a lot of the time I'm kind of essentially imagining it. You know how you get those graphics of like how you kind of map a model in computer space, so just surrounded by blank space. So for Scotus, embodiment, kind of being, no longer has a necessary connection to other things. So you can imagine an angel existing without being in relation to other things in the world. Again, this is kind of really important for kind of modern mathematical understandings of the world, modern scientific understandings of the world. You see it in the kind of different types of maps you get over the late medieval period. So a move away from the sort of less mathematical maps where you're showing basically where things are in relation to you, to kind of imagining things from this God's eye perspective. So for Scotus, angels, their size is kind of determined by the area in which they're acting. So they can be infinitely small, or they can be, well, not infinitely small, they can be almost infinitely small, or they can be almost infinitely big. They can be kind of any size or dimension. They just can't be as big as God, and they can't kind of disappear entirely. So sort of within that bounds, they move around. So, and I think for both of them, the answer is really that an angel's location in a place is not competitive with other things. So if lots of angels were trying to act on one pin, they could all be on that one pin. Lots of angels could become so infinitely small that you could fit kind of almost infinite numbers of them, but not quite infinite numbers of them onto the head of a pin for Scotus. I guess the other part of that is that angels and demons do sometimes assume bodies for the purposes of interacting with people. For example, incubi and succubi, who are fallen angels who steal sperm from men in order to impregnate women, they make bodies for themselves, for Aquinas and the Malleus Maleficarum, the medieval witch hunting manual, out of sometimes compressed air, sometimes kind of earth. So they can kind of take on bodies for particular functions, in which case you probably would struggle to fit even a single angel onto the head of a pin.
I love this so much because I'm getting this picture of like Paul Rudd as Ant-Man, and he's like shrinking down. This very angelic Paul Rudd. I love this though because they're using angels in this like extremely philosophical way to answer, you know, high level metaphysical questions. Whereas in evangelical Christianity and like, you know, the 21st century, angels are mostly just like Bigfoot. They're like cryptids that, you know, kind of come around and appear to you. Anyways, this is far more interesting than any of that. I'm all about this.
Yeah, I'm glad we asked. You know, when we made the question, we thought it was maybe a silly question, but it's not. As we've learned, theology, yeah, the line between silly and serious is so blurry, and I appreciate you bringing us into it. We have some other questions, but I want to come back to, all right, the big list of things you're not supposed to say about angels. I'm suddenly very interested. A thing that I've never known about until 2 minutes ago. What are some naughty ways to think about angels? Ways you're not supposed to do it? Like, what is the church sort of concerned about sorting out those categories? Or, you know, maybe you don't know off the top of your head. I don't know. Maybe I'm asking an unfair question to a theologian, but like, what might be, if I was thinking about angels and I got on a certain path, what might be the point where it's like, don't think about them that way, though? That's a bad way to think about it.
Yeah, well, so the condemnations that kind of prompt the sort of disappearance of or sort of the backlash against Aristotelian theology are the 1277 condemnations, and they list a bunch of different things. One of the ideas, I can't remember in detail all of the ideas they condemn. One of the ideas that they condemn is an idea. For Aristotle, we can think of the world as this kind of nested set of spheres, and so stars and planets are kind of in these celestial spheres. So the world is a kind of nested spheres, and when stars rotate around the Earth, it's because these celestial spheres are turning. What we find in Maimonides, medieval Jewish Aristotelian, is that he argues that the celestial spheres, which Aristotle describes as separate intelligences, are the angels. some of the reasoning is, I love it. He basically says, so we see that, you or I or a cat or a dog kind of run around the earth, and there's no particular obvious pattern to the way that we move around. And if we look at the movement of the stars and the planets, we see that that movement is much more regular, it's much more mathematical, it's much more perfect. And one of the ideas that you find at least as far back as Dionysius is that basically the further you get up the created hierarchy, the further you get to the seraphim, who are the angels right at the top, and the seraphim basically go around God in perfect circles eternally singing holy, holy, holy. And Maimonides' argument is, well, if I were more perfectly rational, I might not just move around kind of zigzagging all over the place. I would probably move in a much more rational way, therefore in a straight line or in a perfect circle. And so it's reasonable to infer that the stars and the planets are intelligent because they're moving in perfect circles. And so it's therefore also reasonable to infer that the celestial intelligences that Aristotle talks about are the same as the angels that the Bible talks about. But you're not allowed to say that after 1277. That's deemed to be heretical. And it's kind of interesting, actually, because that kind of argument by Maimonides, it sounds so much like a lot of the kind of arguments you get about kind of how we can kind of reconcile faith and the Bible. But 1277, they're like, no, we don't like this. I think because it sounds a bit Jewish or a bit Muslim. There's a few other things. I mean, one of the big problems that people grapple with is how do we make sure that we are talking about angels who have to be distinct from human beings, but they also have to be distinct from God. And that causes all sorts of problems for the way that Christians think about angels, because you have to try and imagine these beings who are somehow more perfect than us and still also less perfect than God. So trying to think about a way that they can be limited, but not in the same way that human beings are limited, sets a lot of the terms. One of the things I think is really interesting in kind of contemporary pop culture depictions of the angels is that where for medieval people, there's this real sense that for human beings, and you get this really early on in Christianity, if we were more perfect, we would be more like the angels. The angels live lives that are less determined by kind of change and decay and need. They don't get hungry, they don't get tired, they're not kind of flawed in the same way that we are. So the more perfect we become, the more we will become like the angels. Whereas what you get in a lot of pop culture depictions of angels in the 20th century is actually the sense that the angels are jealous of us precisely because of the things that they don't have, because they can fall in love, because they can taste food. We can fall in love, we can taste food, we get hungry and tired. So I think that you see a real kind of reversal in what we see as being most valuable about human life, and move away from the desire to kind of escape hunger, thirst, sleepiness, all of these things, into a sense that actually that's what makes human life good and worth living and enviable. And I mean, what's interesting about that actually is that in some ways that kind of popular angelology fits more closely with certain bits of Muslim angelology. So Ibn Arabi argues that in contrast to the angels, humans are more kind of complete because we bring together every different aspect of life and existence. We are bodies and we are also minds. So we're kind of right at the center of all the different things that make up the world. So while angels might be more perfect than us in some ways, not least because in Islam angels can't sin, they're also less perfect than us in some ways, precisely because they don't have that kind of richness of kind of being that we have.
Wild. Yeah, it is super wild. It's also great to know what I can't say about angels. So this ancient
make sure
council.
You check the 1277 condemnations carefully before you make any public angel statements.
Really important. I don't want to get canceled for this. The popular culture note is so interesting to me about angels and perfection and how some people work that out. I think that's really fascinating. The popular angelology, I love it. Something else that you mentioned in your book, Theology for the End of the World, is that there's another representation of angels too, as maybe, I mean, not just this like longing to be human, but also as like the grand cosmic functionaries who are like walking around with clipboards and like huge nerds who are keeping the cosmos running. What's going on with that part? Like, how is that just like an artifact of capitalism and thinking through perfection, or something else? What about that part of popular culture?
So I actually think that's it's a bit to do with Dionysius and it's a bit to do with gender. The argument that Agamben makes the Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, is he argues that what we find in Dionysius, so Dionysius creates these ranks of angels, and he also with that creates the notion of hierarchy. So hierarchy kind of comes from sacred power, and basically the idea is that creation exists as this kind of emanation of light, of power from God, and the kind of the further away you get from God, the less of God's light, the less of God's power there is. And the hierarchy of the angels, like the hierarchy of the church, exists basically to kind of receive illumination from God and then to kind of pass it on down the chain. So the holiest angels at the top are closest to God, and they kind of see God, grasp God, and then kind of pass that illumination down the chain. And so the ranks of the angels, like the ranks of the church, are kind of arranged in this hierarchy. And Agamben argues that this hierarchy is basically a bureaucracy, and that actually, if we look at the history of angelology in the West and we look at the history of ideas of government, we find that angelology and bureaucracy evolve in tandem with one another. So how people think that God uses the angels to manage the world shapes how they think we should organize government, either of the state or of the church. But also when we try to imagine what the angels are like, we look at the government of the state, we look at the government of the church, and we kind of map that back onto the angels. And so for Agamben, there's this kind of dual bureaucratic function. One is management, so the angels basically manage the world on God's behalf, and the other is glory, which I think is the kind of theological equivalent of taxes. So they gather up worship, they gather up tribute, and they kind of pass that back up the chain. So really kind of until around the Reformation, angels play this really important political theological role. They help us to think about government, and they help us to think about power. What happens, I think, with around the Reformation, with the emergence of capitalism, with the division of the world into the public masculine sphere of government and the private feminized sphere of the home, is that I think we see a shift in the role that religion plays. And I'd argue that as we get this kind of separation between productive labor and reproductive labor, religion, like other forms of reproductive labor, like housework, like childcare, like kind of moral education of children, starts to become associated with women, starts to become associated with the home. And what we see over the kind of late medieval, early modern period is that increasingly angels are depicted less and less as these kind of masculine androgynous figures, and then more and more depicted as women and depicted as children, and associated with people's private religious, emotional life. And so what you tend to see in 20th century films, at least, I've been working on a chapter about angels in 20th century film, is that angels, basically their function is to ensure social reproduction. So they're kind of bureaucrats of love, maybe. They show up when marriages are in crises, when people are so busy working that they don't have time to fall in love, when children are dealing with dads who've abandoned them, when people are married but their marriage is under strain. That's when these angels appear, often as these kind of bureaucratic figures holding clipboards, and they intervene basically to kind of help people fall in love, help children reunite with their parents, ensure the kind of continuation of the family in whatever form is necessary at that stage of capitalism.
That is awesome. Bureaucrats of Love in the 20th Century is the name of my new incredibly weird album out this fall. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting the way that you talk about the roles angels play socially, and they're these managerial characters. And then also, though, you mentioned that they sort of like, there's like a kind of excess or weirdness that happens with angels sometimes too. And Matt and I have been talking about St. Francis a lot on this podcast lately. And, you know, Francis is also, he's like called an angel of the apocalypse by certain brands of really wild Franciscans. And you have the seraphim as these kind of like incredibly radical, like burning figures of, you know, the end of the world. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that too. Like they're managing the world, but also they're these kind of like signs of doom or the destruction of the world or a new kind of order. So what's going on there? How are angels also maybe subverting the hierarchy that's set up here?
I guess I would want to kind of tie that into the sort of like Gnostic apocalyptic strand of Christianity that tends to not predominate. But yeah, I mean, there is, I think there are some kind of interesting relationships between the figure of the angel and the figure of the eunuch, particularly kind of earlier on, but and also the figure of the monk. And I think actually what all of those figures have in common is there's a sense in which the kind of institutions and the kind of lives that are lived by angels, by eunuchs, by monks are kind of seen as actually disconnected in some really important ways from reproduction. So, particularly, when you get the spiritual Franciscans, you get this insistence on absolute poverty, dispossession, and that kind of goes with celibacy, because what celibacy does, right, is it cuts you off from responsibility for caring for people, for worrying about your family. If you're not worried about your family, you can kind of dedicate yourself to a life of revolution or whatever. And so that possibility, I think, shows up. It doesn't show up. So in the films I've been watching, it's kind of rare, but I think often when you get like really good art that depicts angels, you find something like that. So two examples that spring to mind are Pasolini's Teorema. And that's set in Italy in the 1960s, and it's very explicitly set in the middle of the kind of opening scenes are a factory owner. There are kind of strikes happening at the factory, and this small boy called Angelus brings a note announcing the arrival of this kind of messianic figure, and basically the messianic figure arrives and just totally destroys the lives of each member of the family. And so you get that kind of, the angel is kind of announcing this break or this rupture. I think another really interesting example, and this isn't TV, is Angels in America. So the Tony Kushner play that was also an HBO series. And there you get these angels appearing as these kind of apocalyptic figures. And that is to do with kind of the AIDS crisis and the way that both, I think, the AIDS crisis poses a kind of existential threat to the reproduction of queer lives, but I think also the possibility that actually what's happening there could pose a more radical challenge to the existing order of things. What's interesting in Angels in America is that it turns out it's not that angels envy the human condition, but basically God has gotten sick of kind of timelessness and changelessness and has kind of entered into the world. So I think you do get these moments where you kind of glimpse this more radical possibility. I think because I've mostly been watching like Hollywood films, that doesn't show up as often. It occurs more in the kind of art films, or in kind of Benjamin's figure of the angel of history, sort of just watching catastrophe piling up. And what's interesting about kind of Benjamin's revolutionary politics is precisely it can't be about reproduction. It can't be about we do these things now because we hope that this will produce things in the future. It has to be like, what does it look like for the Messiah to arrive right now in this moment with no kind of expectation or promise of what will come next.
Love it. And let's see. All right, we're going to get more to your book in 1 second, but I do have one last completely arbitrary question for you. So, all right, Dionysius, he made this great BuzzFeed listicle about the 9 different kinds of angels, or classes of angels you can like. There's lots of other important angels that kind of take on singular identities or lives in the Christian tradition. Michael and Raphael, or like in the Catholic Mass, Pope Francis decided we should all say this really wild prayer to St. Michael at the end, and it's very funny, like adding some weirdness back in. St. Michael's out there protecting us from demons and devils and all the rest of it. So I have to ask you, Marika, who is your favorite angel? Who's the best angel in history? You can't say Walter Benjamin's.
One of the things that's interesting about angels is that they aren't named. And one of the things that's interesting about the way that they aren't named is that one of the problems that medieval angelologists grapple with is like, what is the relationship of angels to one another? And I'm actually just going to evade this question and suggest that you should either keep an eye out for or invite Sean Capner to come and talk on your podcast, because he has some really interesting arguments about one of the arguments that some medieval thinkers make is that each angel is a kind of species in itself. So actually the angels are radically disconnected from relations to other angels in ways that human beings are not. And that if we pay attention to the way that plays out in Anselm's angelology, we can learn some things about racial slavery and also about debt. I mean, I can only really think of 2 angels that I know anything about that have names, who are Michael, who's the kind of warrior angel, and Gabriel, who's the angel who gets associated with women in the home. And I'm actually just going to say that both of them are bad. War, leading the nation state to battle, bad. The angel of the home, also bad.
Fair enough. There's got to be some other ones out there that are doing good things. Just yet to discover them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can kind of dig into the Apocrypha. you get to your Metatrons and those ones, but it's a little bit outside my remit at the moment, unfortunately.
My favorite Transformer.
I really like the angels in the recent Noah film, who are these kind of fallen angels, and they like fall to earth and get covered in mud, and then are like big kind of transformer creatures. And it's the kind of standard Christian account of the creation of the angels comes to be Augustine. So Augustine's like, oh, it happens like when God divides between light and darkness, that's when Satan falls, and that's when the angels are. But the more fun one is that it's the Genesis story about the children of God who saw the daughters of men and came and had sex with them and produced the heroes. And that's definitely the kind of more fun origin story, I think.
That's true. The Ancient Avengers. Well, let's talk about your book a little bit, because I think it's really fascinating and definitely want people to know about it before it comes out, so they can put it on their book wish list or whatever people do with books. I don't know. So you sent us this chapter beforehand to kind of take a look at in the Theology for the End of the World book, and this chapter on angels I think is really fascinating. And in that chapter, you draw out angels as these like aspirational characters who don't have to worry about human stuff like sex or work and can focus on, fixing the world in the soteriological sense or something. But in the end, you conclude that this is like the wrong way to think altogether. And instead, thinking about Christianity as doing a type of work to save the world is just like kind of a complicated idea. That you argue that like the world is useless to God, which is a very fun turn of phrase that I think like probably would ruffle the feathers of many Christians, but in a good way. So talk us through this whole thing. Help us connect the dots here. How is the world useless? What does all of that mean? And why are you right?
Yeah, well, so one of the kind of difficult to answer questions in Christian theology is what was God doing before God made the world? And Agamben, when he's talking about the angels, he's basically like, theologians are very embarrassed by this question, and you can tell that they're embarrassed because they say things like, Augustine, in response to the question, what was God doing before God made the world? He's like, he was preparing hell for people who pry too deep. And then later on, Luther, in response to the same question, says, oh, God was sitting in the forest carving sticks to beat people who ask questions they shouldn't be asking. So basically, it's difficult to answer the question. And the reason it's difficult to answer the question is by the time that Christian theology kind of comes to depend on kind of Neoplatonic understandings of God, what you get is this idea of a God who is perfect, and that understanding of perfection is that God cannot change, because if God was changing, God would either be getting better, in which case that suggests that God wasn't perfect to start with, or God would be getting worse, in which case even if God started perfect, God isn't perfect now. So God can't change. God also can't need anything, because if God needed something, then that would mean that God was dependent on something that wasn't God. And so basically you can't, in this kind of classical theological framework, say that God had any reason at all for creating. It can't be that God was bored. It can't be that God was lonely. It can't be that God needed something from creation that God didn't need. It can't be that God had to create, because if God had to create, then God is bound by some necessity outside of God's self. So basically the proper theological answer to the question, why did God create the world, is for no reason. There was no reason. We can't explain it. It's a mystery. You can kind of fancy it up by saying, oh, just out of the excess of God's love. But that still is just saying we don't know. You can be like, oh, God just overflowed, but God didn't have to overflow. So really the answer is nothing. And partly what Agamben argues is that this whole kind of complex bureaucracy of heaven, all these angels like circling round and round going, holy, holy, are really just to kind of distract us from the fact that we don't know what happens before all of that stuff comes into being, and we would rather not think about it. And another thing that's interesting is that embarrassing question, why did God create the world, is basically the same as the problem of why did the devil fall. So one of the kind of functions of angels, I think you've had Adam Kotz go on to talk about this before, but is one of the things that the idea of angels do for Christian theology is let theologians explore this question of freedom. And so God created the angels knew God, they were created so that they had everything they could possibly need to be happy. And so the question of why they fell is really difficult to articulate. And ultimately the answer is the same: for no reason, nothing. And I think one of the things that tends to happen in Christian theology is once you say, well, once creation happened, then you had a fall, that gives you a whole bunch of stuff to do, right? Things have gone wrong and we have to fix them. But that prior question, well, why did things come into being in the first place, means that we can't just get stuck in this logic of kind of utility, that if God created the world and the fall wasn't necessary, we ultimately have to say that there is no reason for the world to exist. It's just pure excess or pure lack, maybe both of them at the same time, if you want to be like Lacanian about it. So fundamentally, the purpose of life is not to solve the problems that were caused by sin. Fundamentally, the purpose of life is there is no purpose, kind of joy, excess, no reason at all, insert your own answer here. And I think that one of the things that happens both in Christianity and actually in left politics, insofar as it comes out of Christian ways of thinking, is it gets really caught up in this logic of things have gone wrong and we have to fix them. And that doesn't actually fundamentally answer the question of why are we trying to fix things in the first place. And again, this kind of fits with kind of Benjamin's idea of the angel of history, that one of the things that Benjamin is trying to say is, as long as we think that things exist for a purpose, we are constantly willing to sacrifice anything and everyone as long as this purpose is achieved. You can do all sorts of terrible things to people if you think that in the process of making them suffer, they may eventually accept Jesus into their hearts and be saved from eternal damnation in hell. You can do unimaginable violence if you think that, ultimately this violence is in service of the arrival of communism. So when we have this view of history that it's about overcoming, making right what's wrong, fixing things, and we can justify doing all kinds of terrible things in the name of this kind of ultimate goal. But if we start to say that actually there is no ultimate goal except nothing, joy, fill in your own answer here, then we have to think a little bit differently about how we see people around us, how we relate to the world, and we have to actually move a bit away from a kind of instrumental reason. And I think that is potentially useful as a way of thinking about like how do we engage with the world around us in a way that isn't kind of instrumental and isn't willing to kind of sacrifice people on the altar of history.
This is such a really interesting idea and also a very difficult idea, but I'm committed to thinking about it some more here. I think what's so cool about it is that it does paint God as like some kind of like weird existentialist is how I feel. Like, it's just like, I don't know, existence is absurd in the first place, so I guess I'm going to do something with it, which is very funny. I love God as this big French guy smoking a cigarette in the sky. A yet unrealized idea about God for me. I guess I was also thinking too about the second creation story in Genesis, where it just, it's affirming that just existence is good, that stuff is good, and that's kind of it. And I don't know, a challenging thought, but I really like it. I really like the idea that we don't know why we're here, but we're here, and that's cool, yeah. I guess.
And I think it comes in as well to questions about work, right? Like, what is the point of work? It's really easy to get kind of caught up with all of these ideas about like work achieves something, or if we work hard, we'll build this new society, or all of these kinds of things. And I think what that precludes is the kind of radical political possibilities of idleness. What if work just sucks? Or sometimes we work and it's not for any particular reason.
I love it. As a person whose brain is permanently broken by both Christianity and left politics, and I'm constantly running around trying to save the world to very little effect, I find that very useful to me specifically. Talk to us too a little bit about angels in relation to that, because that whole bit about work and how work is so important and integral to capitalism is a central feature of that essay we mentioned earlier that you wrote when you were thinking about Donna Haraway and cyborgs and angels. All extremely fun things to put in a big soup that turns out to be a great essay. What are maybe angels sort of telling us about capitalism and the nature of work, and what are we supposed to do with these guys, Marika? It seems like they're they're running around and telling us to work all the time. And are we supposed to be get out of here? I don't want these angels around. Are we supposed to become cyborgs? What are we supposed to be? Can we just be regular people? What's the deal here?
The way that angels function as this kind of image of government is really tied to the way that they also are figures of technology. And this kind of ties in, I think, to the Michel Serres book you were talking about last week. So Marx's definition of a machine is that you have a power source, you have a transmitting mechanism, and then you have the things that actually do the work. And one of the things I argue in that article is like that's what angels are. So God is the kind of origin. The role of the angels in the role of hierarchy is precisely to transmit the power, the illumination of God down to earth, and then we do these things. The philosopher of technology Lewis Mumford argues that the first ever mega machine in human history is the kind of complex social organization that built the pyramids. And obviously that complex social organization that built the pyramids relied very heavily on lots of people doing work, including enslaved people. But it also relied on the technology of writing, he says. And the thing about writing is it lets you communicate a message without that message being corrupted, without it being changed. And again, one of the things that angels kind of figure is the things that humans would do if we weren't kind of limited by physicality, right? Angels aren't going to forget the message that God made them in the same way that a paper isn't going to like lose a bit of the message unless, you know, the paper decays or whatever. So there's a sense in which this kind of certain forms of social organization are made possible by and in certain ways maybe produced by particular kinds of technologies. So there's this real kind of entanglement. And I guess, you know, Marx's argument about the difference between a tool and a machine is a tool is kind of in the control of human beings. Like you decide when you're going to start hammering and when you're going to stop. But when it's a machine, we're constantly trying to kind of keep up with the machine, to work at the pace of the machine. Machines don't tire like we do. They don't need sleep at night. And so I mean, you could make a kind of Luddite argument about what the angels figure, right? These kind of huge systems of capitalism, of kind of factory production, of the internet that is made of people, but also made of the kind of technologies that allow communication and kind of perfect transmission to happen. Well, I mean, it's never really perfect, is it? But, you know, the more kind of faster, more perfect forms of transmission. So we are kind of caught in this big machine. And then I guess the question is what we do about that. And I think this is kind of where I think we see a similarity between the angels and the figure of the cyborg, right? So in the same way that the angels both represent what we think human beings would be like if we were more perfect. So you look at the kind of conversations that Christians are having about angels in any particular historical period, and you'll learn some things about what they think are the real problems with human nature and what we should be kind of struggling against to overcome. But they also become the kind of the figure of the perfect rebel. So the fallen angels are the demons, and therefore these kind of figures of absolute rebellion. And it's similar with the kind of figure of the cyborg, right? We both see these kind of pop culture depictions of cyborgs as perfected humans. I think you can track some really interesting shifts, both around like what the kind of ideal work it is, and also in terms of where technological development is happening. So like mid 20th century science fiction, you get a lot of really kind of rational robots or computers, and they're sort of just trying to figure out how to be more rational than we are. And what I feel like you've started to get in the 21st century is more depictions of the attempts to kind of automate emotional intelligence. So you start to get these, you know, like in Her or Ex Machina, you get these kind of feminized artificial intelligences that where the kind of test of whether you kind of are conscious is not whether you're more rational than humans, but actually whether you're more able to be kind of either more able to fall in love or more able to convince other people that you've fallen in love. So there's some kind of complicated stuff going on there. So I think in both angels and humans, in both angels and cyborgs, you see people kind of trying to figure out like, well, what would human beings be like if we went wrong? Also, what is the kind of idea of the kind of bad version of ourselves that we're defining ourselves against? So there's a bunch of stuff going on there around kind of race and gender and those kinds of things as well.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting too. You know, there's this interview somewhere with Paul Virilio where they're asking him about Donna Haraway, and he says, you know, something like, I forget exactly what the question is, something about someone asked Donna Haraway, would you rather be a goddess or a cyborg? And she says, I'd rather be a cyborg. Very funny, great rhetoric. And they're like, really, what do you want to be, a god or a machine or what? And he's like, I don't know, I just want to be like a guy. Like, can't I just be a human? And I like really appreciate that response, but also it is kind of like, you know, it's a bit of a conservative response because it's like, well, being a human is actually really weird and complicated and, you know, in all these ways that Donna Haraway, but also theologians seem to talk about. And it seems like angels and cyborgs, they're these kind of, you know, as we've been talking about, these thought experiments, you know, they open up these other ways of speculating about ourselves. So what is it about thinking about angels or cyborgs that maybe helps us reflect too on what it means to be a person? How can we keep thinking about angels in the 21st century?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that what does it mean just to be a guy, right? Like you have to have centuries and centuries of like sociological, economic, technological developments that produce this idea that you can be just a guy, like just an object floating in space without relation, right? Like this is one of the products of the modern world, this idea of things that have like dimension but no location, this idea that you can exist and not be part of this like massive machinery of creation. And I think that I think it's easy to sort of, and I think I maybe do this a bit, to be honest, in the Angels and Cyborgs article, to say, you know, we're part of this big machine, maybe we should smash the machine. But I think the kind of the other side of that is to be human is always to be deeply caught up in these like complicated webs and tangles of causation and dependence, that actually a lot of what we are is not kind of located within us. Who we are is who we are in relation to the world around us. That, you know, the idea that I decide when to move this kind of tool is maybe always a kind of fantasy of self-possession. And so I think if we want to kind of imagine moving beyond a model of the self that relies on kind of ideas of private property, that relies on this idea that to be free is not to be a slave, then actually we sort of have to have a more complicated way of grappling with the question of kind of freedom and dependence.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, again, is a really challenging idea. But I think it's that particular question about technology always seems really worth pursuing to me, as especially as, I don't know, things. I don't want to say things get more technological because that's not necessarily true. Things have always been technological. But I think as the fantasy about humans and technology kind of grows in a particular direction, I think it's always great to sort of reaffirm our co-determination in the world with stuff. We'll never just be guys, unfortunately. we can strive towards being guys, but we'll never just be them. Marika, thanks so much for jumping on the pod with us, though, and talking through angels and enduring the silly questions that we came up with. Deeply appreciate it. And do you want to tell people when your book will be out and where they can find it?
It is, so it's out on the 31st of July. If you are in the UK, you can pre-order it from SCM Press. It is not yet available to pre-order in the US and Canada and elsewhere, but will be certainly will be from the 31st of July when it comes out, possibly before then. If you want up to date updates on that, you can always follow me on Twitter, and I will make sure to post links as soon as I have them.
Cool. We'll include your Twitter and all of that great stuff in the show notes, and definitely also post the link to the big fund for all of you at the University of Winchester.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me on. It's been really fun.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you give us $1 of your hard-earned money, you can join our great Discord channel, and also get access to our Behind the Paywall podcast called The Lock-In, where we do some silly stuff and read current events and read the Reddit, the Christianity subreddit. It's fun, I would say. As the producer of this, it's good.
It's fun, and we did accidentally stumble on our own sort of internal angelology, I feel like, except that we've inadvertently turned human beings into angels. There's a whole lore behind it. It'll take you a while to catch up, but don't worry, you'll get there.
And maybe you never will, and that'll be fine too. Okay, our intro music is by Amaria Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation, never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have